The lights inside CNN's New York headquarters glowed like polished glass, reflecting off the sleek set design that viewers across the country had come to know. Camera operators in black polo shirts moved with quiet precision, adjusting tripods and testing focus points. Beyond the bright circle of the stage, the rest of the studio lay in cool shadows, filled with the low hum of equipment and the occasional rustle of note cards. Danielle Carter sat in the green room just off stage, a plain paper cup of coffee from the corner's Starbucks cradled in her hands. A young production assistant had handed it to her with a polite smile and a "good luck tonight, ma'am," before rushing away to tend to another guest. Danielle had tipped the cashier earlier out of habit, just like her mother used to, even for small orders. At 41, Danielle was no stranger to high-pressure rooms. She'd walked into courtrooms packed with people who didn't want to hear her arguments win the day. She'd faced juries whose expressions told her they were skeptical before she even opened her mouth. This, bright lights, a studio audience, a debate watched by millions, was just another room. Different walls, same stakes. Across the building, in a separate green room, Rebecca Hayes was laughing with a makeup artist she'd personally requested for the evening. Rebecca's years as a primetime news anchor had taught her every trick of on-camera presence, how to angle her chin to catch the light, how to pause before delivering a memorable line, how to make a pointed remark land just as the camera cut in for a close-up. The two women would meet in just minutes. On stage, Michael Anderson, CNN's seasoned debate moderator, straightened his tie and glanced down at the cue cards in his hand. He knew tonight's subject, immigration policy and border security, was combustible in any political climate. But with these two, it was almost certain the sparks would fly. Danielle Carter, the first black woman to represent her Texas district, a former civil rights attorney known for grilling hostile witnesses in congressional hearings. Rebecca Hayes, a Trump-endorsed former TV personality turned political contender, quick with a sharp retort and a loyal base that loved her combative style. When the floor manager's countdown hit 0, the studio erupted in applause as the two women stepped into the light. Danielle wore a tailored navy suit, crisp white blouse, and a small gold pin shaped like the scales of justice. Rebecca opted for a bold red dress and pearl earrings that shimmered under the stage lights. "Good evening," Michael began, his voice measured, almost formal. "Tonight we have two distinguished guests joining us for what promises to be a spirited conversation about one of the most pressing issues in American politics." The first segment started smoothly enough. Rebecca spoke with the confidence of someone used to leading the conversation, rattling off talking points about border chaos and failed Democratic policies. Danielle listened intently, jotting notes with a black pen, her brow furrowed just enough to suggest focus without irritation. When it was her turn, Danielle leaned slightly toward the microphone, her voice calm, deliberate. She cited data from Customs and Border Protection, contrasted it with economic reports, and tied it back to her district's real-world experiences. No flashy language, just facts, clearly explained. She told a brief story about a family in El Paso who had been separated under previous policy, then reunited after a legal intervention she'd supported. The audience shifted forward in their seats. Rebecca countered, repeating a familiar refrain about prioritizing American citizens first and hinting at crime statistics. Danielle nodded once, then addressed each point with a precise rebuttal, citing official FBI reports that contradicted Rebecca's claims, explaining the nuances of federal versus state enforcement, and challenging the assumption that immigration policy could be reduced to sound bites. By the 15-minute mark, a subtle shift was happening. Rebecca's remarks, while polished, began to feel recycled. Danielle's answers were crisp and anchored in specifics, making the contrast sharper with every exchange. Michael sensed it too. He glanced at the clock. "Let's move to a follow-up question for both of you," he said. "How do you balance border security with humanitarian obligations?" Rebecca spoke first, pivoting to a story about her visit to a detention facility. Her tone was confident, but Danielle noticed the generalities. No mention of legislation, no concrete proposals. When her turn came, Danielle described a bipartisan bill she'd co-sponsored that allocated funds for both enhanced security technology and increased immigration court staffing, reducing backlog times. She named the senators involved, the budget line items, and the projected outcomes. The audience murmured in approval. Even a few journalists in the front row scribbled notes more quickly. Rebecca's jaw tightened, just a fraction, but Danielle caught it. She'd seen that look in opposing counsel before, a flicker of awareness that the ground was shifting under their feet. In the control room, a producer whispered to the director, "Carter's landing clean. Hayes is starting to look defensive." Michael moved them to the next question, but Danielle could feel it. The rhythm of the debate was tipping her way. She stayed steady, not overplaying the advantage. Years in court had taught her that the moment you press too hard, you give the other side a chance to recover. Still, Rebecca's eyes had taken on a sharper gleam. She gripped her pen a little too tightly, tapping it against her notes as Danielle spoke. The cameras might not catch it, but Danielle did. It was the same body language she'd seen before someone abandoned the argument at hand for something, anything, that could throw her opponent off balance. Michael wrapped the segment. "We'll take a brief break, and when we return, we'll continue our discussion on immigration policy with Danielle Carter and Rebecca Hayes." The lights dimmed just slightly, signaling the commercial cut. Danielle took a sip from the water glass on the podium, steady hands, steady breath. Rebecca leaned in toward her own mic, whispering something the audience couldn't hear. Danielle didn't flinch. She just met Rebecca's eyes and gave the faintest smile. Somewhere deep in her gut, Danielle knew the real fight hadn't started yet. The return from commercial break felt different. The applause was polite but thinner, as if the audience sensed something under the surface. Rebecca Hayes adjusted her microphone and offered a practiced smile toward the camera. Danielle Carter stood in quiet readiness, her pen poised over the notepad in front of her. Michael Anderson's voice carried the same measured calm. "We've been discussing the balance between border security and humanitarian obligations. Let's shift now to how these policies affect everyday Americans. Representative Carter, you've been vocal about..." But he didn't get to finish. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, cutting in before Michael could hand the floor to Danielle. "You know what, Danielle?" she began, her tone dripping with casual condescension. "Maybe if you spent less time on your appearance and more time actually reading the bills you vote on, Texas might have better representation." The words landed in the studio like a dropped glass, sharp, sudden, and impossible to ignore. For a fraction of a second, everything seemed to pause. Camera operators froze mid-pan. In the control room, the producer's voice cracked through the headset. "Did she just—" Michael blinked, caught between his role as moderator and the knowledge that something unprecedented had just happened live on air. Danielle didn't move. Years of standing in front of hostile juries and dealing with sneering opposing counsel had trained her body to stillness in moments like this. She let the silence breathe, the weight of it pressing against the studio walls. Rebecca, mistaking the pause for hesitation, leaned back with the faintest smirk. Danielle's voice, when it came, was calm. "Rebecca, I want to make sure I understand what you just said. Are you suggesting that my appearance somehow affects my ability to represent the people of Texas?" Her tone was even, almost curious, like a professor guiding a student toward their own mistake. Rebecca didn't hesitate. "I'm just saying that maybe if elected officials spent more time reading legislation and less time on other things, the American people would be better served." Danielle tilted her head slightly. "Other things," she repeated, letting the phrase hang. "Could you be more specific about what other things you're referring to?" It was the kind of question that in a courtroom would have an attorney scrambling to object. Here, under bright studio lights, there was no safety net. Rebecca waved a dismissive hand. "I think it's pretty obvious. When you spend that much time and money on your appearance, your hair, your makeup, your clothes, it raises questions about priorities." The murmur from the audience was audible now. A man in the third row shook his head. Two young women near the back exchanged glances, eyebrows raised. Even in the polarized world of modern politics, everyone knew Rebecca had just crossed a line. Danielle's gaze stayed steady. "So you believe that my hair, my makeup, and my clothes indicate I'm not focused on my legislative responsibilities?" "I'm just saying what a lot of people are thinking," Rebecca replied, settling back in her chair like someone who believed they'd just delivered a decisive blow. Danielle didn't answer right away. She glanced briefly at Michael, who looked as though he might intervene, but he stayed silent, perhaps sensing the moment was about to turn into something far bigger than the debate's original topic. The camera zoomed tighter on Danielle. She set her pen down deliberately on the podium, both hands resting lightly on the edges. "Thank you," she said softly, almost like she was speaking to herself. "Thank you for making something very clear to everyone watching tonight." Rebecca's smirk faltered just slightly. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You've just demonstrated exactly the kind of disrespect that Black women face every single day in professional settings." Somewhere in the audience, a single clap broke the tension, quickly silenced by the weight of the moment. "You've decided," Danielle continued, "that because I am a Black woman who takes care of her appearance, I must be less serious about my job. You've reduced my law degree, my years as a civil rights attorney, and my work in Congress to the way I look." Rebecca started to speak, but Danielle held up one hand, calmly, firmly. "No, Rebecca. You wait a minute. You want to talk about priorities? Let's talk about priorities." Michael shifted in his seat but still didn't cut in. Danielle leaned forward just slightly, her eyes never leaving Rebecca's. "My priority is representing the 760,000 people in Texas who sent me to Congress to fight for them. My priority is the Voting Rights Act that I've worked on since before I was elected. My priority is making sure working families can afford health care and that our children get a quality education." Rebecca's expression had shifted from smug to something closer to guarded. "And since you seem concerned about my appearance," Danielle went on, her voice steady, "this hair you're talking about, these are my natural curls, which I spent years learning to love because people like you told me they weren't professional enough. This makeup, I wear it because if I don't, people ask if I'm tired or sick, and then my appearance becomes the story instead of my work." A ripple of recognition moved through the audience. Rebecca's lips pressed together, but she stayed silent. Danielle wasn't done. "And these clothes? I buy them because if I dress casually, people question my professionalism. If I dress too formally, people say I'm trying too hard. If I dress fashionably, people like you claim I'm focused on the wrong things. That's called a double standard." It was impossible not to notice the shift in the room. The tension was still there, but now it was weighted in Danielle's favor. Rebecca's eyes darted toward Michael, perhaps hoping for a change of topic, but Michael stayed neutral. Danielle paused, letting her words settle. Then, with the faintest smile, "Tell me, Rebecca, have you ever criticized a male colleague for being well-dressed? Ever suggested a man's appearance means he's not serious about his job?" Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it again. Any answer would make her look worse. "I didn't think so," Danielle said quietly. The applause started slowly, then grew until it filled the studio. Rebecca shifted in her chair, crossing her arms. Danielle reached for the folder in front of her, sliding a single sheet of paper to the top. Her fingers rested on it like a chess player about to move a piece they knew would change the entire game. The applause tapered off, replaced by a tense, anticipatory hush. Danielle Carter's fingers stayed resting on the folder in front of her, but she didn't open it yet. Timing was everything. She knew better than to rush a turning point. "Rebecca," she said, her tone measured, "thank you for making something very clear to everyone watching tonight." Rebecca Hayes blinked, her posture stiffening. The confident smile she'd worn earlier had thinned, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Danielle's eyes swept the audience briefly before returning to Rebecca. "What you've done is give a perfect example of why so many women, especially Black women, have to fight twice as hard just to be taken seriously. We have to show up twice as prepared, speak twice as clearly, and still, we get reduced to our appearance." The audience murmured in agreement. A woman in the second row leaned toward her friend and whispered something, nodding toward Danielle. "Let's be honest here," Danielle continued, her voice low but cutting through the room. "You didn't criticize my policy positions just now. You didn't address my record. You went straight for my hair, my makeup, my clothes, as though the work I do means less because I choose to look professional while doing it." Rebecca opened her mouth to interject, but Danielle didn't give her the space. "And I want everyone watching at home to remember this moment," she said, turning her gaze toward the camera. "Because it's not just happening to me. It happens in boardrooms, in classrooms, in courtrooms. Every single day a woman is told, directly or indirectly, that what she looks like matters more than what she's accomplished." Rebecca gave a small, tight laugh, as though trying to brush off the point. "Danielle, you're making this—" "No!" Danielle said sharply, but without raising her voice. "You made this. I'm just not going to let you pretend it's something else." The audience let out a collective of approval, the kind that comes from recognizing a point that hits home. Michael Anderson, seated between them, glanced from one to the other. His instinct as a moderator told him to redirect back to policy, but his journalist's sense told him this was the story. He stayed quiet. Danielle took a step back from the podium, not away from the fight, but to give herself room to move. She rested her left hand on the edge, her right hand gesturing as she spoke, controlled but deliberate. "Here's the thing," she said. "I didn't come here tonight to trade insults. I came here to talk about how we secure the border while protecting our values. But you, Rebecca, you opened a different door. And now that it's open, we're going to walk through it." Rebecca shifted in her seat, crossing one leg over the other. The smile was gone now. "See, I believe that when someone shows you who they are, you should believe them," Danielle went on. "And what you've shown tonight is that when you can't win on the facts, you'll go after the person." In the control room, a producer muttered under his breath, "She's got her pinned." Danielle leaned in slightly toward Rebecca. "You called my priorities into question, so let's talk about priorities." Rebecca's chin lifted. "Gladly." Danielle tilted her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Not yet," she said. "First, let's set the ground rules. We're going to deal in facts, not assumptions, not stereotypes. Facts. Can you agree to that?" Rebecca hesitated. "Of course." "Good," Danielle said. She reached for her folder, sliding it closer, but still didn't open it. "Because the thing about facts is, they tend to speak for themselves." She turned back to the audience. "In my career, whether in court, in committee hearings, or here tonight, I've learned that the most powerful thing you can do when someone comes at you with nothing but noise is to respond with substance. And substance," she tapped the folder lightly, "is exactly what I have." The tension in the room was palpable. Even Michael leaned forward slightly, curious about what was in those pages. Rebecca tried to look unfazed, but her eyes flicked to the folder and back again. Danielle's voice softened, almost conversational now. "I've been in situations like this before. Once, early in my career, I was cross-examining a witness who thought underestimating me was a smart move. He made a little comment about how I clean up nice. I smiled, just like I'm smiling now. And then I took him apart, piece by piece, with nothing but the truth." A small ripple of laughter passed through the audience, not mocking, but appreciative. "And Rebecca," Danielle said, "tonight is starting to feel a lot like that day." Rebecca's jaw tightened. Danielle took one step closer to the podium. "But before we get to the details, I want to make something clear. When you attack a person's appearance, what you're really saying is that you have nothing left to stand on, that your case is empty, and that's a dangerous place to be, because it means the other person has the floor." Rebecca tried to cut in. "My case is far from empty." "Then you'll be fine when we look at the record," Danielle replied instantly, not missing a beat. The studio audience reacted with a burst of applause and a few shouts of encouragement. Danielle let the moment settle, then laid her palm flat on the folder. "In here," she said, "is everything I need to answer your question about priorities. And when we open it, well, I think the American people are going to see something they won't forget." Rebecca gave a short laugh, but it was forced. "Go ahead." Danielle glanced at Michael. "We'll get there," she said. "But first, let's talk about why these kinds of comments about hair, makeup, clothes, are more than just personal opinion." Now, Michael gestured for her to continue. "Because when you say them to a woman, especially a woman of color, you're tapping into a long history of telling us we don't belong in these spaces. You're saying, without saying, that we have to prove ourselves twice before you'll even hear us once. And the problem with that, Rebecca, is that I've been proving myself for years. I've been proving myself in courtrooms, in Congress, and yes, even here, under these lights." The audience responded again, some nodding, others clapping softly. Danielle stepped back, letting her words linger. Then she looked directly at Rebecca. "So, before we go any further, do you still want to have this conversation about priorities?" Rebecca didn't answer right away. She glanced toward Michael, then back to Danielle. "Sure," she said finally, the edge in her voice betraying her discomfort. "Good," Danielle replied. "Then let's get to it." She slid the folder fully open, the pages inside neatly organized, tabs sticking out in bright colors. The sound of paper against the podium was louder than it had any right to be. The audience leaned forward. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. And Danielle, with the calm of someone who had planned this moment all along, said, "Let's start with something simple. Social media." The studio air felt heavy, like the seconds before a thunderstorm breaks. Danielle Carter stood with her hands resting lightly on the podium, the folder open before her like a case file in court. "Social media," she began, her voice calm but carrying to the farthest corners of the studio. "In the last 6 months, Rebecca, you've posted 47 professional photos of yourself on Instagram." Rebecca Hayes tilted her head, lips curling into something between a smile and a smirk. "Is that a crime now?" Danielle didn't look up from her folder. "No, but it's interesting." The control room director whispered to the producer, "Get a split screen, Carter on the left, Hayes on the right." The cameras adjusted instantly, catching Rebecca's subtle eye roll. Danielle flipped to the next page. 47 photos, glamour shots, headshots, carefully staged images. That's more than I've posted in my entire time in Congress. She looked up now, meeting Rebecca's eyes. "And you felt comfortable criticizing me for, what, caring about my appearance?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Rebecca straightened. "Danielle, you're comparing apples and oranges." "No," Danielle cut in smoothly. "I'm comparing your words tonight to your actions over the last 6 months, and they don't match." Michael Anderson shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking between them. He knew this was the point where some guests might start to falter. Danielle turned another page, the sound crisp in the quiet. "But let's go beyond Instagram. Let's talk about campaign spending." Rebecca's shoulders squared. "Go ahead." Danielle's tone stayed even. "According to your publicly filed campaign finance reports verified by the Federal Election Commission, you spent $89,000 on hair, makeup, and wardrobe during your gubernatorial run." The number seemed to echo in the room. $89,000. The audience gasped audibly. A man in the front row shook his head slowly. Someone in the back whispered, "Wow." Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but Danielle was already moving. $89,000, she repeated, is more than the median household income in Arizona. It's more than many public school teachers make in a year. It's more than I've spent on my appearance in my entire political career. Rebecca's voice rose, sharper now. "That's not the same. My campaign required you to spend more on your appearance than some families make in a year?" Danielle asked, her tone still calm, but her words hitting like a hammer. The audience reacted again, a mix of low murmurs and sharp inhales. Danielle didn't let up. "And while we're on the subject of requirements, let's look at your voting record during your time in Arizona politics." She slid another sheet forward. 3 times, you voted against funding for public education. You opposed a healthcare expansion that would have helped hundreds of thousands, and you supported tax cuts that primarily benefited wealthy developers, while claiming there wasn't enough money for infrastructure repairs. Rebecca's face flushed. "Those votes were about fiscal responsibility." Danielle stepped forward, her voice firm but not raised. "Fiscal responsibility? While spending $89,000 on hair and makeup?" A few members of the audience laughed, not because it was funny, but because of the sheer audacity of the contrast. Rebecca tried again. "These are completely separate issues." "They're about priorities," Danielle said, cutting her off again. "You attacked mine tonight, so I'm showing yours." Michael glanced at the clock but didn't intervene. This was no longer a segment, it was a moment. Danielle turned another page. "While you were posting glamour shots and spending campaign funds on your appearance, I was working with a bipartisan group of lawmakers to secure $3 billion in federal funding for Texas infrastructure projects. While you were approving tax cuts for the wealthy, I was authoring legislation to expand healthcare access for 50,000 Texans." Rebecca opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Danielle let the silence hang just long enough. "So when you ask me about priorities, Rebecca, here's what I want to know. What exactly have you accomplished for the people you claim to represent?" The audience burst into applause. Even some of the production crew, supposed to remain invisible, nodded in approval. Rebecca glanced toward Michael, perhaps hoping for a pivot, but he stayed still. Danielle closed the folder halfway, as if to signal she could stop here. "From where I'm standing, it looks like the only person in this conversation who's been putting appearance over substance is you." The applause grew louder. Michael waited for it to die down, but Danielle wasn't finished. She straightened her notes, then spoke directly into the camera. "And here's the thing. This isn't about whether someone cares about their appearance. It's about whether they care more about that than doing the job they were elected to do. The American people deserve leaders who come prepared, who do their homework, who fight for policies that actually help working families, not leaders who use their platform to tear down others when they can't win on the merits." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. Her earlier confidence had evaporated. Danielle finally closed the folder and set it aside. "Now," she said, "shall we get back to the immigration policy you said you wanted to discuss?" It was the most polite mic drop the studio had ever seen. The energy in the CNN studio was electric, charged with that rare awareness that everyone present was witnessing something unforgettable. The applause from Danielle Carter's last line still echoed faintly as the lights glinted off the closed folder on her podium. Rebecca Hayes sat with her shoulders stiff, her fingers locked together so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She had walked into this debate certain she could out-talk, outmaneuver, and outshine her opponent. Now it was clear the opposite was happening. Danielle didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply opened the folder again, her movements calm, deliberate, like a surgeon preparing for the final incision. "Rebecca," she began, her voice measured, "you've told us tonight that my appearance raises questions about my priorities. Let's set aside the irony of that for a moment. Let's talk about your record. Not in general terms, but in specifics." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "I've been transparent about my record." "Good," Danielle replied. "Then you won't mind if we review it." The audience murmured, sensing the temperature rise. Danielle turned to a marked page. "According to Arizona state legislative records, during your tenure, you voted against increasing public school funding 3 times. You also voted against expanding health care coverage to an estimated 300,000 residents, and you supported a tax cut that primarily benefited developers with projects valued over $10 million. Rebecca interjected quickly, "Because the state couldn't afford—" Danielle didn't miss a beat. "Couldn't afford it, yet you found $89,000 to spend on your own appearance during your campaign?" A ripple of disbelief spread through the audience. Even Michael Anderson's eyebrows lifted slightly. Rebecca tried to recover. "Campaign expenses are part of doing the job?" Danielle interrupted, her tone still controlled. "Because from where I stand, the job is serving the people who elected you, not making sure you look perfect in every photo op." The audience applauded, louder this time. Danielle leaned forward, her voice now carrying the intensity of a cross-examination. "Let's break this down, Rebecca. While you were spending nearly 6 figures on hair, makeup, and wardrobe, Arizona classrooms were facing teacher shortages. Students were using outdated textbooks. Rural hospitals were shutting down. And yet, you told those communities there wasn't enough money to help them." Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Danielle flipped to another page. "Meanwhile, in Texas, I was working on bipartisan legislation that brought $2.3 billion in infrastructure funding to my state. That funding repaired highways, modernized water systems, and created thousands of jobs. While you were posting glamour shots on Instagram, I was sitting in committee meetings, negotiating across the aisle to get those bills passed." The applause swelled again. Rebecca looked to Michael as if to say, "Are you going to step in?" But Michael remained still, understanding that the debate's center of gravity had shifted completely. Danielle let the applause fade before delivering the next blow. "So I'll ask you again, Rebecca. What exactly have you accomplished for the people you claim to represent?" Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavy and undeniable. Danielle straightened, her voice softening, but the steel in it remained. "Because from where the American people are sitting tonight, it looks like your priority has been you." The studio erupted. The applause was thunderous. People on their feet, some even whistling. It was less like a debate now, and more like the aftermath of a championship game where the winner had just been crowned. Rebecca sat frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down. Every camera angle captured her stillness, the way her earlier confidence had drained completely. Danielle didn't look at her. Instead, she turned to the audience, then directly into the camera. "Our job as elected officials is not to tear each other down over personal choices that have nothing to do with our ability to serve. Our job is to show up prepared, to know the issues inside and out, and to fight for policies that help real people. That's the standard I hold myself to, and it's the standard I believe the American people should demand from all of us." She paused, letting the message sink in. "And if someone can't meet that standard, well, you've just seen what happens." The applause was deafening. Even Michael Anderson, ever the neutral moderator, couldn't help but nod in appreciation. Rebecca shifted in her seat, clearly eager for the segment to end. Her hands smoothed the skirt of her dress, but she kept her gaze fixed downward. Danielle closed the folder for the last time, a small but decisive gesture. The cameras caught it perfectly. It was more than just the end of a point. It was the end of the fight. When the applause finally subsided, Michael cleared his throat. "We'll take a final break before closing statements," he said, his voice a touch lower than before, almost reverent. As the lights dimmed for commercial, Danielle leaned back slightly, exhaling through her nose. She wasn't smiling, not yet, but her eyes held the calm satisfaction of someone who knew they had done exactly what they came to do. Rebecca, on the other hand, sat perfectly still, as if movement might draw even more attention. In the control room, one of the producers muttered, "That wasn't just a debate moment. That was a career moment for one of them." And everyone in that building knew which one. The moment Michael Anderson announced the final commercial break, the studio dissolved into a swirl of movement. Cameramen adjusted their rigs, floor managers murmured into headsets, and a low buzz rose from the audience as people leaned toward each other, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Danielle Carter stood at her podium, collecting her notes with the same unhurried precision she'd shown all night. A production assistant darted forward to hand her a fresh bottle of water, and she thanked him quietly before slipping the cap open. Across the stage, Rebecca Hayes remained seated. She adjusted her microphone, then her dress, then the stack of unused note cards in front of her. Her gaze stayed fixed on the polished wood surface of the podium, as though avoiding eye contact with anyone might soften the sting of what had just happened. The crew signaled for the guests to move toward the green rooms. Danielle gave a polite nod to Michael and stepped off stage, heels clicking softly against the black floor. The narrow hallway smelled faintly of coffee and the lingering sweetness of the donuts the crew had set out earlier. A young CNN staffer passed by carrying 2 lattes from Starbucks, a small cardboard tip jar still clinking with change from the cafe counter. In the green room, Danielle set her folder on the table and finally allowed herself a slow, measured smile. Her phone, left face down on the table, was buzzing nonstop. She flipped it over. Texts from her chief of staff, fellow House members, college friends she hadn't heard from in months. One simply read, "You made history tonight." Her communications director, a tall man with salt and pepper hair named Grant, slipped inside. "Twitter's on fire," he said, holding up his phone. "The clip of you asking her what she's accomplished. It's already over 2 million views, and it's not even been an hour." Danielle arched an eyebrow. 2 million? TikTok's even faster. People are putting dramatic music under it, freeze-framing when she went silent. Danielle took a sip of water, her mind already shifting to the broader implications. Viral moments could be fleeting, but some stuck. And she knew, deep down, this one might stick. Meanwhile, on the other side of the building, Rebecca sat in her own green room, her team clustered awkwardly near the door. Her campaign manager was speaking in a low voice, but Rebecca kept shaking her head. "They're going to twist it," she said, her voice brittle. "They always twist it." No one had the heart to point out that there was little to twist. Millions had watched the exchange live. Back in Danielle's room, Grant was reading headlines aloud from his phone. "Carter School's haze in live CNN debate. A masterclass in preparedness. The $89,000 that ended a campaign. When style meets substance, substance wins." Her policy advisor, Maya, poked her head in. Calls from MSNBC, NPR, even the New York Times. "Everyone wants you on air tomorrow." Danielle smiled faintly. "Let's take it one at a time. I still have a district to represent." Maya grinned. "That's exactly why this works. You never forget that part." By the time the debate aired its closing credits, the clip was already making its way through every corner of the internet. On Instagram, celebrities who rarely waded into politics shared it on their stories, adding captions like, "This is how it's done," and "Preparation wins every time." On Twitter, a retired schoolteacher from Phoenix wrote, "As an Arizona voter, I can tell you, Danielle Carter just said everything we've wanted to say for years." The post had 150,000 likes in less than 3 hours. Even some conservative commentators admitted grudgingly that Rebecca had walked into a trap of her own making. One talk radio host said, "You don't go after someone's looks unless you're ready for them to come back swinging with receipts." And boy, did she have receipts. The next morning, news programs across the spectrum ran segments dissecting the moment. CNN replayed it in slow motion, pausing at the exact second Rebecca's expression shifted from confident to cornered. MSNBC called it the political equivalent of a checkmate. Even Fox News, while defending Rebecca's broader platform, conceded that this was not her best night. In law schools, professors downloaded the clip to show in classes about debate strategy. Political science instructors added it to their syllabi under media moments that changed careers. Back in Texas, Danielle's congressional office phones rang nonstop. Constituents called to congratulate her, to say they'd watched every second, to thank her for standing up not just for herself, but for women everywhere who'd been told, implicitly or explicitly, that they didn't belong in the room. At her favorite diner in Dallas, the owner taped a printed screenshot of Danielle at the podium to the front counter, right beside the pie menu. Underneath, she'd scrawled in Sharpie, "Our girl." Rebecca's campaign, meanwhile, was scrambling. Major donors were suddenly reassessing their commitments. A planned fundraiser in Scottsdale was quietly canceled. and the $89,000 figure, now immortalized in memes, was becoming a shorthand for misplaced priorities in political commentary. She appeared on a friendly morning radio show to defend herself, but the host's attempt to spin the debate in her favor fell flat when a caller bluntly asked, "Why'd you bring up her looks in the first place?" Rebecca's pause before answering was all anyone needed to hear. 2 weeks later, Danielle was invited to give a keynote at a national leadership conference in Chicago. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation before she said a single word. She began not with the debate itself, but with a story from her early career, about a case where her opponent underestimated her, and how that mistake mirrored what had happened on CNN. Her closing line brought the house down. If someone tries to reduce you to the way you look, make sure you can stand on what you've done. Late one evening, back in her district office, Danielle sat at her desk reviewing constituent letters. One caught her eye. It was from a high school senior in El Paso. "Dear Representative Carter, I watched you on CNN. I've been told my hair is too wild, my voice too loud, my style too bold. But now, when they say those things, I'll think about how you stood there and didn't back down. Thank you for showing me that what I know and what I do matters more than what I look like." Danielle set the letter down, feeling the weight and the warmth of it all at once. She didn't need polls or headlines to tell her what that debate had meant. Letters like this, was the real measure. The clip of that night continued to circulate, not just as political entertainment, but as a lesson. In offices, classrooms, and community meetings, people watched Danielle Carter take an attack meant to diminish her and turn it into a moment that elevated the conversation and herself above the noise. And somewhere deep down, Danielle knew it wasn't just about winning an argument. It was about showing, in real time, that truth and preparation could outshine even the most polished performance. Long after the lights in the CNN studio dimmed and the applause faded, Danielle Carter's words kept traveling through living rooms, coffee shops, and cell phones across the country. People didn't just watch that debate, they remembered it. Not because it was loud or messy, but because it was honest. For the Black community, it was more than a political win. It was a public reminder that dignity and preparation can stand taller than insult and prejudice. Many saw in Danielle's calm, steady presence a reflection of their own mothers, aunts, and grandmothers who had carried themselves with grace even when the world tried to make them small. In the days that followed, the clip of Danielle turning the attack into a teaching moment played on news channels, appeared in classrooms, and became a talking point in church gatherings and family dinners. Folks who didn't usually watch politics found themselves replaying the exchange, nodding at the way she shifted the focus from appearance to achievement, from style to substance. Members of the Black community in cities from Atlanta to Oakland wrote to her office, telling her how they'd faced similar moments. Job interviews where their hair became the topic, meetings where their ideas were ignored until someone else repeated them. Danielle had not only spoken for herself that night, she'd spoken for them too. But the moment's reach extended beyond one group. Veterans saw it as an example of discipline under fire. Teachers admired the clarity of her argument. Even those who disagreed with her politics admitted they respected her composure. The lesson was universal. When you know your work, your facts, and your worth, no amount of provocation can pull you off course. Danielle didn't spend much time celebrating. She returned to committee hearings, district events, and policy drafting. If the debate had given her a bigger platform, she intended to use it to push for the legislation she'd been fighting for all along: better schools, affordable health care, safer communities. And perhaps that was the greatest takeaway. A single night can change the arc of a public life, but it's the work before and after that night that truly matters. Danielle had been ready because she had done the work for years, long before the cameras found her. For those who watched, especially those in the Black community, the memory of that night was a quiet reassurance. When the moment comes, preparation can be your greatest armor, and truth your sharpest blade. And for everyone else, it was a gentle but firm reminder. Judge leaders by the lives they improve, not by the labels or appearances others try to use against them.